Today on CJ Off-Road, we're going to be putting a massive 6-inch lift on our 2017 Silverado. We previously had a 2-inch lift kit on our 2017 Silverado, but that just wasn't enough, so we installed a massive Fabtech 6-inch lift, and today we're going to show you how we installed it. This Fabtech 6-inch lift kit comes with everything you need to lift your truck for a killer look and improved off-road capabilities. It comes with heavy-duty drop spindles to replace the factory ones, as well as cross members, strut spacers, rear blocks and shocks, and other hardware that you'll need. It'll work with your Silverado if it has stamped steel or aluminum upper control arms, and it'll give it a solid 6-inch lift for an absolute killer look that isn't over the top, so let's get to the installation. For this installation, you're going to need a lot of hand tools, pretty much your entire toolbox, standard and metric tools, also some cutting tools, and you're definitely going to want an extra set of hands. Okay, we have the truck up in the air, we removed the wheels and disconnected the battery. The first thing we're going to do now is remove the factory skid plate. Remove the two 15mm bolts at the top front of the skid plate. Then the remaining four 10mm bolts. Remove the two 10mm bolts on the brackets that the ABS line attaches to. Remove the connector for the ABS sensor from its bracket. Release the red clip. Remove the two 18mm bolts securing the brake caliper. Once you get the second bolt out, make sure you hang up the caliper. You don't want it hanging from the brake hose. Disconnect the sway bar end link using a 15mm wrench and socket. Remove the bolt and the end link. The brake rotor can then be removed by removing this torque screw. Grab a 36mm socket and remove the axle nut. Then remove the washer. Loosen up the lower ball joint nut, but do not remove it. Loosen the nut on the tie rod, but don't remove it. Now we're going to use a hammer and hit the spindle to release it from the lower ball joint. Okay, we got it loose. Now we'll move on to the tie rod. We don't have to hit the upper ball joint because during the removal process of the lower, the top one actually popped out too. Remove the nut on the upper ball joint. We're going to thread the nut back onto the ball joint just so we don't lose track of it. Remove the tie rod completely. And the lower ball joint. Now the spindle can be removed. To remove the strut, there's three 15mm nuts up top. They're pretty hard to get to, but I promise they're up there. Remove the two 15mm bolts on the bottom of the strut. The sway bar needs to be dropped now. There's two 10mm bolts holding on each bracket. Remove the strut. Remove the 6 bolts holding on the axle. Locate the brake hose bracket on the factory brake line and remove it. It can be a little bit tricky, but with vice grips and a flathead screwdriver, you can do it. With a 24 and 18 millimeter socket, you can remove the nut and bolt that secure the lower control arm. Remove your second nut and bolt, and the lower control arm can come out. We have everything removed and out of the way on the driver's side. Now before we go into removing the cross members, we're going to do the same thing to the passenger side. The factory rear cross member needs to be removed. We're going to start off by removing these two 15 millimeter bolts right here. Then there's two 18 millimeter nuts and bolts on each side of the cross member that need to be removed. Once you get the last bolt out, repeat the process on the other side, and then the cross member can drop. To install our Fabtech cross members, the rear lower control arm mounting bracket needs to be modified. We have to measure 3.5 inches in, mark our point, and then cut it off. We're going to measure 3.5 inches in on this bracket, make our mark, and then we'll cut all the way around this bracket. We have both sides of this lower control arm mount marked to be cut. We're going to do the same thing to the passenger side as well. Once you make your cut on both rear lower control arm brackets, measure 1 inch down from the mounting hole on the front of the pockets and cut that off. In order for our front Fabtech cross member to fit on the front cross member, we need to cut about 1/4 inch of material off of these corners right here. They're a little bit rounded right now, so we need to cut about 1/4 inch off to make them nice and square so the cross member can fit up there nicely. Our cross member's looking really good. We can move on to the next step. To drop the differential, we have to unbolt the drive shaft. There's 4 11 millimeter bolts holding it on. Then separate the drive shaft. Next, we're going to be working with the steering rack. Remove the bolt on the steering knuckle. It's an 11 millimeter. We have the bolt out, now we're going to mark it to make sure we reinstall it the exact way it came apart. We have our knuckle marked, now we're going to move on to removing the wiring. Release the harness from all of its clips. There's 4 bolts holding the rack on, 2 18 millimeter bolts on the passenger side. Those are the ones we'll remove first. Then there's 2 24 millimeter bolts on the driver's side. Now the rack can be removed. Unplug all 3 of these connectors on the rack. The steering rack needs to be trimmed a little bit for it to properly fit, so we're going to mark it and cut it. Okay, your end result should look something like this. Now that we're finished our cut, we're going to remove our tape. The differential is going to be removed next. Unplug this connector. Disconnect this vacuum hose on top of the differential. Remove the 2 18 millimeter bolts holding in the differential on the driver's side. Then there's two 21mm nuts on the passenger side. With the differential removed, locate the front mounting tab on the passenger side of the differential. This needs to be cut clean off with the axle, right here. The next thing we have to cut is this differential locating pin on the driver's side differential mount. We're going to cut it off and make it nice and flush. With the locating pin removed, we can install the driver's side differential drop bracket with the factory hardware. The bolts then get torqued to 75 foot-pounds. Install the passenger side differential drop bracket. Install the factory nuts. Torque these nuts to 75 foot-pounds as well. Install the hardware that Fabtech provides into the drop brackets. Install the provided U-bolt into the drop bracket, then the nuts and washers. At this point, we can reinstall the steering rack. We're going to start by inserting the steering shaft into the knuckle. Reinstall all the factory hardware into the rack. Don't fully torque these bolts just yet, leave them a little loose, and then we'll reconnect our harness. Plug in the connector on the differential as well. The front Fabtech crossmember can now be installed using the factory bolts. Make sure you install the factory washer, then the nut. Grab the provided bushing kit and install it into the differential support bracket. We're going to lube it up to make it a little easier to install. All right, there we go. Remove and discard these 3 factory bolts on the differential. Install the differential support bracket with the provided hardware and a little bit of Loctite. Torque those 3 bolts to 58 foot-pounds. Install the rear crossmember with the factory hardware. Don't forget the factory washer, then the nut. Install the bolt for the differential support bracket into the rear crossmember. Then the washer and nut. Install the differential skid plate with the provided hardware. Torque these bolts to 83 foot-pounds. Tighten the rear bolt on the skid plate. Then the front 2 bolts. Torque the front two bolts to 50 foot-pounds. The rear bolt gets torqued to 74 foot-pounds. Install the lower control arm. Grab your factory spindle and remove the 3 bolts holding on the wheel bearing. We have our new Fabtech spindle and we're going to put our dust shield on it, but it needs to be trimmed a little bit. We're going to trim about 1 inch right here at a diagonal line. Just need to trim this so it can clear the spindle. Make a mark just like this on the dust shield, that way it can clear the spindle. With it trimmed, we can install the dust shield onto the spindle, then our wheel bearing. Install your factory bolts into the wheel bearing, use a little bit of thread locker, then torque them to 125 foot-pounds. Install the axles into the differential with the factory hardware and a little bit of thread locker. Torque the bolts to 55 foot-pounds. I actually have a socket locking the axle in place to hold it still. Locate your factory strut and install the Fabtech spacer. They are side specific, so make sure you have the driver's side spacer on the driver's side strut. Then install the factory nuts with a little bit of thread locker. With the strut spacer on, we can install the strut with the provided nuts. Lift the lower control arm up and attach it to the strut with the factory hardware. Install the axle spacer onto the factory axle. Then our new spindle can go on. Install your new spindle onto the lower ball joint and upper ball joint, and also the axle. Install the axle nut. Tighten the lower ball joint with a 24mm socket and a 5/16 hex key. Torque the upper ball joint to 58 foot-pounds. Torque the axle nut to 83 foot-pounds. Once again, I have a socket holding this axle in place so I can torque it. At this point, we're going to remove the factory tie rod and install our Fabtech tie rod. Break loose the lock nut. Leave the factory jam nut in place where it was and install your Fabtech tie rod up until it contacts the jam nut. Get it into the spindle, install your nut, and then tighten the jam nut. Reinstall the drive shaft with your factory hardware. Remove the factory brake line bracket with a 13mm socket. Pull on this factory brake line a little bit, then install your new drop bracket into the factory location. Then you're going to attach the factory bracket to your new bracket just like that. Install the bracket with the factory and provided hardware. Then attach the drop bracket to the factory bracket with the Fabtech provided hardware. Tighten it down with an 11mm socket and wrench. Reroute the ABS line and secure it to the spindle with the provided hardware. Reconnect the ABS sensor. At this point, you can repeat everything that we did on the driver's side onto the passenger side. Then we're going to go back and torque all of our bolts, and then we'll come back and reinstall the sway bar. We're now going to install the Fabtech sway bar drop bracket with the provided hardware and a little bit of thread locker. The bolts then get torqued to 58 foot-pounds. Install the Fabtech bolts into the sway bar bracket, then the sway bar. Install the factory sway bar end link. Reinstall your brakes. Get the brake calipers back on. All right, at this point we're completely finished with the front of this truck. Now we can move on to the rear. We move to the back of the truck, and the first thing we're going to do is remove the driver's side e-brake cable bracket. Remove the brake line bracket from the top of the differential. Release both brake line clips on the axle, just to give you a little bit more play. There's 3 more brackets on the differential we're going to remove just to give us a little bit more play. Remove the upper bolt on the shocks. Then the lower hardware on the shock. Remove the bolt, then the shock. Make sure you support the differential with a pull jack, then remove the 4 nuts on the U-bolts. Lower the differential to remove the U-bolts and block. Remove the U-bolts and block. Install your new lift block and make sure that it's facing front. There's an indicator right here. Install your Fabtech U-bolts. Install your factory bracket with the Fabtech hardware. Tighten the nuts with a 7/8 socket. Torque all the U-bolt nuts to 90 foot-pounds. With a 10mm socket, remove the bolt that holds on the factory bump stops. Use the provided bolt and insert it into the frame and thread it into the factory nut to come out of the bump stop mount. It's a little bit tricky to get it started, but it is possible. Then tighten it with an 11/16 wrench. Put some Loctite on the bump stop extension threads. Thread it onto the bolt. To install the factory bump stop, you have a couple options. You can either trim down the factory bolt to make it properly fit on the extension, or you can add 3 of the provided washers, then install it into the bump stop. Thread the bolt into the bump stop extension. Install your new Performance Fabtech shocks with the factory hardware. Now do the same thing to the other side. Torque the upper and lower shock bolts to 65 foot-pounds. Install the brake line extension bracket onto the differential. Use the factory bolt to mount it to the differential. Then use the provided hardware. Reinstall the rest of your brackets. To make sure our ABS wire is safe, we're going to tie it out of the way with a zip tie. But you don't want to make it too tight. Now for the final touch, we'll install our Fabtech sticker. Okay, we got our Fabtech lift installed on our Silverado. It's looking absolutely killer. I love the way it looks. It could use a slightly larger tire though. We only have 33s on it right now. And the Fabtech upper control arms will go really well with the lift too. Installation is going to take you the whole weekend, and before you know it, you'll be heading off-road.